Dennis Lusava was a young man living in the Mbururu area of Kakamega County, Western Kenya. In the year 2020, he was just 31 years old and in the prime of his life when, in a tragic turn of events, he was found dead. His battered body was found floating on River Nzoia in a decomposing state and in a gunny bag. It would later emerge that his life had been cut short in a horrific revenge mission against him by guys he had quote-unquote crossed. So who killed Dennis Lusava and why? Welcome back to the Crime Gist. My name is Damisa. Dennis Lusava Malongo was the son of Agnes Ambale and Stephen Malongo. Details of his early life, education, and career are records that remain largely undocumented. The records also do not reveal details about Dennis's marital status, only that he was a father of 2 little girls, one in grade 2 and the other in grade 8 at the time our story today took place, that is the year 2020. That year, Kenya, like many other countries, had strict mask mandates in place to curb the COVID-19 pandemic that was wreaking havoc throughout the world. On the evening of 4th October 2020, Dennis Lusava was going about his daily business. At the Mbururu market area, he encountered 2 policemen, that is Constable Ruben Yator and Constable Godwin Wekesa. These officers, attached to Mbururu police post, spotted Dennis without a mask and immediately moved to arrest him. But what should have been a simple citation, warning, or arrest escalated very quickly. Dennis Lusava thought the officers were being unfair and violent in their approach and began arguing with them. Members of the public who were around at the time witnessed the officers' heavy-handed approach and intervened. They called out the 2 policemen and insisted that they should let Dennis go, but the officers weren't willing to do that. In this altercation, and in a bid to resist the violent attempt at arresting him, Dennis Lusava bit Police Constable Ruben Yator's finger. By then, there was a big crowd of people that had gathered and they were all shouting at the officers. So the 2 officers, outnumbered, finally let Dennis go. However, this whole altercation felt very humiliating to the 2 constables. Their authority had been challenged and their pride wounded. In their minds, Dennis Lusava had made them look like fools, and this public embarrassment was unforgivable. He had gotten away this time with the help of members of the public, but the officers vowed to arrest him on first sight and charge him with assault on an officer. This for biting Constable Ruben Yator's finger. For now, they left the market to go seek medical attention for the officer, as his finger seemed to have been dislocated. 3 days passed. Dennis Lusava likely thought the incident was behind him, like just another unpleasant encounter with police during pandemic times. He had no way of knowing that this was far from over. The police officers were plotting their revenge. After treating his finger, the next day, Police Constable Ruben Yator traveled from Kakamega to Nairobi to attend to other matters. But his friend Constable Godwin Wekesa was left at the station. Godwin Wekesa was still plotting and looking for ways to get a hold of and arrest Dennis. And so he decided to talk to another officer known as Police Constable Emmanuel Wafula, telling him all that had transpired at the market. Together, they hatched a plan to lure Dennis to them. On 7th October 2020, that is 3 days after the market incident, Emmanuel Wafula and Godwin Wekesa put their plan into motion. They used one of Dennis Lusava's friends to lure him to them. On this day, Police Constable Ruben Yator, that is the man whose finger Dennis had bitten, was still away in Nairobi. There was no indication that he knew of Emmanuel and Godwin's sinister plan. On the morning of October 7th, at around 8:30 a.m., Dennis was having breakfast at his mom's house with his mom and his mom's sister when moments later, one of his friends showed up at their door. He greeted everyone good morning and asked to speak with Dennis outside. After a brief conversation, both men walked towards the market, which happened to be the same direction as Mbururu police station. An hour later, at around 9:30 a.m., Agnes Ambale, that is Dennis's mom, received a call from a friend who sold vegetables at the market. The lady told Agnes that she had just witnessed her son Dennis being dragged into Mbururu police station by 2 officers. She urged Agnes to come down to the station and check on her son. Immediately, Agnes Ambale and her sister left from Mbururu police station. When they got there, the sight that greeted them was hard for them to bear. Agnes found her son handcuffed to a window in the police cell. He was severely injured, bearing visible marks on his body. It was evident that he had been subjected to a brutal assault. He wasn't even able to speak well. Agnes sent her sister to buy food for Dennis, but when it arrived, he could barely eat. His hands were so swollen and injured that he couldn't hold the food or even a spoon properly. Incredibly, the 2 officers stood there and physically forced him to eat anyway. Then, Agnes noticed something. Dennis was only in a pair of shorts, contrary to what he had left the house with, which was a pair of trousers and a maroon t-shirt. He had been tortured to a point that his clothes had been torn up, leaving him shirtless and only in a pair of shorts that he had been wearing underneath his trousers. It was then that his mom decided to go back home and bring her son some clothes. By then, it was already past midday. Before she left, the officers began demanding for money to release Dennis. They asked Agnes for 2,000 Kenyan shillings. But since her and her sister didn't have the money on them, she said that she'd go back home and bring the money together with Dennis's change of clothes. Agnes and her sister came back at around 6 p.m. and asked to see Dennis. They had with them his clothes and the 2,000 shillings they had been asked for. However, the officers dismissed them, saying that they had already released Dennis while they were away. And so, Agnes rushed back home, expecting to find her son there, safe and recovering. But instead, she was highly disappointed when she found an empty house. Dennis hadn't come back home. Immediately, she had a terrible growing fear in her chest. And sadly, her son wasn't ever going to come back home. While all this was happening, her husband, that is Dennis's dad, Stephen Malongo, was away in Kisumu for work. So Agnes spent the next few days agonizing over the whereabouts of her son. If he had really been released by the police, why wasn't he coming home? And so, like any hurting mother would do, she kept going back to Mbururu police station, demanding that her son be produced, demanding answers. But no one was willing to help her. Every day, the officers would tell her the same thing. We released him. They even showed her entries in the occurrence book that supposedly proved that Dennis had been let go. But Agnes knew better. A mother knows when something is wrong. Her son would have come home. He would have called. He wouldn't just disappear. So, not willing to give up, she kept coming back to Mbururu police station. This was until a big break, 4 days after Dennis went missing, that would crack this case open. On 11th October, a body surfaced on the banks of River Nzoia. It was taken to Ebuye mortuary. Upon further investigation, the body was identified as that of Dennis Lusava. This was done with the help of his father, Stephen Malongo, who positively identified his son at the mortuary. At the time of all this happening, like we said, Mr. Malongo was away in Kisumu for work. He had come back to try locate his son after finding out that he had been arrested and then gone missing. Dennis's body was found tied up with a rope around his hands and legs. He had bruises and torture marks all over his body, showing the full horror of what had transpired to him. Later, a post-mortem report revealed that he had suffered extensive injuries, which led to circulatory failure. People around the Mbururu community had a pretty good idea of what had happened to Dennis. They knew that he had last been seen in police custody, where multiple people saw the 2 well-known officers assaulting him. Anger from the community was immediate and intense. Local residents, outraged by what had happened, set fire to Mbururu police post, demanding justice and the arrest of the 2 officers involved. With the growing public concern and outcry, the 2 officers needed to be arrested and, at the very least, investigated on these torture and murder allegations. The nation was watching. But as we all know, police officers rarely do a good job investigating themselves or one of their own. And that is where the Independent Policing Oversight Authority, or IPOA, and the International Justice Mission, or IJM, came in. The two working together took charge of the investigation and eventually the charging and trial of the two officers. Investigators worked methodically to piece together the events that led to Dennis Lusava's death. They took witness statements and examined physical and other forms of evidence. At the end of the investigations, IPOA investigators had established a clear chronological sequence from the initial confrontation through the 3-day gap to the luring of Dennis back to the station and his subsequent death. They determined that Bururu Police Post was the only location where Dennis could have sustained his fatal injuries, ruling out other possible scenarios. The evidence they gathered allowed them to charge the two officers with murder. This case finally reached the High Court in Eldoret in the year 2022. During the trial, a total of 21 witnesses testified and 27 exhibits were presented. The prosecution presented their case, basing it on evidence that directly linked the two officers to Dennis's death. This included forensic evidence, cell phone records, eyewitness accounts, and other technical evidence that helped establish the officers' involvement. They showed how a confrontation over a mask had escalated into murder and how it was driven by the officers' desire for revenge after facing public humiliation. 3 days after encountering Dennis without a mask and getting humiliated in public, the officers weren't done yet. They arranged for Dennis's arrest. They sent a friend to lure him to the station. There, they tortured this young man mercilessly, causing a lot of soft tissue injuries that later proved fatal. Witness after witness came forward. People who had seen the original incident testified about the officers' violent behavior and the community's intervention. Most damning of all were the witnesses to the torture itself. First, a guy who had been called to the station to fix Officer Emmanuel Wafula's motorbike gave his account of how he had witnessed the officers beating up Dennis. Second was Agnes Ambale's own testimony, which was heartbreaking but very crucial. She described finding her son chained to the window, beaten up beyond recognition, and unable to eat due to his injuries. This failure to eat as well invited more violence from the officers. Third was a clinical officer who also bore witness to what had happened to Dennis. This clinical officer gave his witness account of how he had seen a bleeding and injured Dennis run from the police station towards his clinic before collapsing at the entrance. Dennis was attempting to seek medical help after being assaulted for hours. But following closely behind him were the two officers. He watched in horror as the two police officers dragged Dennis back to the station while beating him. He was screaming in so much agony and pain. This was happening sometime on the evening of 7th October, somewhere between 5 to 6 p.m. Once back in custody, the officers handcuffed Dennis to a window and subjected him to a more vicious assault involving kicks, punches, and beatings with electrical cables and sticks. The clinical officer could still hear the screams of pain before everything suddenly went silent. Unbeknownst to him, he had just witnessed what would be Dennis's last hour. That's because somewhere between 6 and 6:30 p.m. that day, when Dennis's mom came back to the station with his change of clothes, the officers refused to let her see him. They insisted that they had already released him. It is believed that by this time, Dennis was already dead in the cell, his body broken by the violence he had experienced in the hands of the two officers. But, as evidence would later reveal, the officers' crimes were far from over. Now, they were faced with a new problem, a dead body in their custody that they had to get rid of. So they had to think fast. At around 8 p.m. that night, Officer Emmanuel Wafula called his friend known as Obadiah, requesting to borrow his car. He said that one of his friend's wife was in labor and that he needed the car to help rush her to the hospital. Obadiah, not suspecting a thing, was more than willing to help. So, Officer Emmanuel Wafula delivered his motorcycle to Obadia and took Obadia's car. This car was believed to be what they used to transport Dennis's body to Ebuye Bridge. The officers had tied the body up with rope and placed it in a gunny bag. On the way to Ebuye Bridge, as evidence would later reveal, the two officers switched off their phones at the same time, that is at 9:23 p.m. When they got to the bridge and under the cover of darkness, they dumped Dennis's body into the flowing waters of River Nzoia. This was designed to make his death look like a disappearance rather than a murder. They returned Obadiah's car at 3 a.m., then went back to the station where they falsified the occurrence book to make it look like Dennis had been released alive. They thought they had committed the perfect crime. All these attempts at covering up their crimes could have probably worked out for them had the body not been recovered 4 days later. The discovery of the body led straight back to the two officers in whose company Dennis had last been seen. The evidence left no doubt as to what they had done. For example, when Obadiah's car was swept, investigators found a bloody t-shirt and rope. They all had DNA matching that of Dennis and the two officers. Secondly, Dennis's body was found covered in injuries. The officers had beaten him with electric cables, with sticks, fists, and hands. Investigators recovered some of these weapons in a pit latrine in the station. Something else that was very useful were the phone records. This showed that the two officers had switched off their phones at exactly the same time while on their way to dispose the body. The switching off of their phones that night and only switching them back the next day pointed at an attempt to cover up what they had done. As for the defense in this case, they had very little to work with. Although the two pleaded not guilty, they faced the nearly impossible task of explaining how a healthy young man who was in police custody ended up in a river. The evidence against them was overwhelming. The timeline was also clear and the motive had been established. There was nowhere left for the officers to hide. On July 29, 2025, nearly 5 years after Dennis Lusava's death, Justice Nyakundi delivered his verdict. The prosecution had proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Police constables Emmanuel Wafula, 38, and Godwin Wekesa, 35, were found to have grossly abused their power. They acted in direct contravention of their duty to protect life. Their sentences, 35 years imprisonment each. This was a landmark moment in Kenya's ongoing struggle with police accountability and custodial deaths. It was symbolic to many Kenyan families who have lost their loved ones to police brutality. The country has witnessed a disturbing rise in deaths occurring in police custody in recent years. The most recent one being that of Albert Ojwang, which I covered on this channel. For Agnes Ambale and her family, after nearly 5 years of grief, legal battles, and waiting for justice, the verdict brought a measure of closure. Justice had been served. Today, Emmanuel Wafula and Godwin Wekesa sit in prison cells, their own freedom taken away as a punishment for taking Dennis Lusava's life. And somewhere, the waters of River Nzoia continue to flow, bearing witness to a tragic story. You have to wonder whether these officers had previously abused their authority or if they have other victims out here who never received justice. But our case today is a warning to all those police officers who abuse their power. They will be held accountable, even if justice takes years to achieve. That brings us to the end of our story today. As usual, please do not forget to subscribe, to like, and to share this episode with other true crime junkies like yourself. See you right here on the next one.